finding holes. I do a lot through there, and it's because of that. So I got my water in here too, so breaks. So I'm going to be talking about an algorithm that we developed at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and this was to quality control time series data that we collected in Juneau, Alaska. And you can see here, it's a later point of the reflection. So you can see here we have, this is the top of Peak Mountain, which is just right outside of Juneau, Alaska. And it's, I think, would qualify as a harsh environment. We had, you have winds coming off the glaciers there that are about 120 knots. And you have rime ice that's built up on these lighting rods. And then we have anemometer wind direction that is on top of some of these instruments, on top of some of these pylons. And so we collected some data from these sensors. And as you can see here, we have a time series from an anemometer. This is the wind speed. And then here we have the same time interval from the anemometer right next to it. We had pairs of anemometers to try to quality control our data sets. And you can see here that we have these really suspicious dropouts in our data. And the idea was we wanted to try to develop an algorithm that could identify these types of anomalous data. And as a human, maybe looking at these time series and not necessarily knowing anything about them, as you go down the set of time series, for instance, this data here looks really bad. This data here is very suspicious. This data here is very suspicious. And of course, here you have data out here that's looks like a noise type stuff. So we really wanted, even though we saw this was our starting point for the algorithm, we really wanted an algorithm that would work over a broad class of outliers for our time series. And then over here on the right-hand side, we have a space-based portrait of this time series, which I'll discuss in detail later or further on the algorithm, further on in the presentation. But right now, I just wanted to show these examples of, here we have some really bad data. And as humans looking at this bad data, we can pretty easily identify what we think the suspect data is. So these cases that we studied were broken down into our nominal case. We had this dropout case, a non-stationary. This was aircraft vertical velocity, which was from a research aircraft. Masking, this was this anemometer wind direction. Then we have another case called the block case, and then we have our uniform noise case. So this again was motivated by the time series data that we collected in Juneau.
Can you hold the microphone a little?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Okay, thanks. So this was motivated by the time series data that we collected in Juneau. And so we had numerous cases of bad data, and we want to mimic the human ability to identify this bad data. And essentially, this is an optimization problem. You really want to, when you look at this bad data, segment the data into autocorrelated data and data that's not autocorrelated. So, going back to our use cases, you can imagine if you were to do something like just calculate a z-statistic, and use that to say, here I'm going to measure my outliers with this z-statistic. With our nominal case, that would work really well if you had a really large window. But then, of course, if you did a similar sort of thing here, it might work really well if you use the entire hour, but instead, imagine you use a smaller window to calculate your z-statistic. And then when you got to these regions, like in here, your z-statistic was going to say, gosh, we've got good data. And so it's really hard to find a sort of one-size-fits-all algorithm that's going to correctly identify when you have outliers, because it really comes down to you really need to look at multiple time scales, at least in the case of time series data, in order to do that. And so, this is this is sort of a starting point. We really want something that's a multi-resolution. And what we'll see as we go on in the talk here, you'll see that we've done that to some extent. And the other thing is that it is really difficult to come up with one size fits all algorithm. And what we have done here is come up with essentially a framework in which you can start. And so if you have a favorite quality control technique that you like and you use with your data a lot, you can actually fit that into this framework. We'll see that. So here's just a quick outline of the algorithm. So what we're going to do is we're going to use image processing techniques in the time domain, and then we're going to cluster data in delay space. And then we're going to use a decision tree to identify the failure mode. And then we're going to score depending on the decision we make from the use of our decision tree. And we published these results in a paper that was printed in the Journal Atmospheric and Oceanic Technology. There's also a patent on this. So going to this time delay embedding idea, it's really pretty straightforward. So here we have our field sample for a time series problem. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an ordered pair of points. Here at point 1, at time 1 and point at time 2, that becomes an ordered pair over in delay space. And so let's see here, where's 1 and 2? That's one of these points up here. And so you can also see that now, for instance, when you look at time 3 and time 4, that becomes, this point falls off the y-axis over here. And then as you work through it, you see that, this transition back up occurs up here, these 2 points occur down here, and then, all the points that sort of fall in here, fall in there. So you can start to see the basis of an algorithm where you can generate clusters over in delay space, and that corresponds to data in the time domain. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to calculate clusters. We're going to use density clustering and time and tiles. And so here you have the phase picture, the delay space picture of the time series and the associated clusters that are going to be found. And you can do this so much work taken in the time domain. You can calculate a sequence of histograms and then turn that into a density, and you can calculate density clusters in the time domain. And this is the corresponding time series data down here. So you have that, you have those density maps, and you can apply a threshold. You can get a sequence of clusters in both time domain and in delay space. And what you can then do, what we then do is you consider this as a hierarchical clustering algorithm. And we're going to start here. You look at convexity, and what we want to do is we want to find the cluster that is contains mostly good data. So here's what we do is we can calculate a sequence of clusters, and we calculate the convexity of those clusters, and then we drop down through those clusters and then we pick our optimal best cluster. So going back to the case where we had the block noise, this is the associated delay space of that time series. You can see here we found a cluster that contains most of the data using that hierarchical clustering algorithm. And we, from that, you can calculate then a z-statistic type score and assign that score to your data points. And so what we've done is that we found essentially an initial guess of what our good data is by looking at the delay space. Because if you hadn't done this, you were trying to just calculate a statistic based on all your data, you could be more statistical. So now you can translate that back into the time domain, and then use that to find optimal clusters in your time domain. Again, using hierarchical clustering. And so here we have our optimal clusters that we found in the time domain, and optimal clusters that we found in delay space. And you can see here's our 6 examples. And the clusters are actually, doing what you would want in the time domain. They're
you're picking out the data that you would actually, I mean, heuristically as a human would pick. But you can also sort of see an interesting thing too, in that if you combine the information from delay space and the time domain, you can start to figure out which of these failure modes you have in your data. So for instance, with nominal data, you have a single cluster here on the y plus x axis. And then down here, you have another single cluster. And down here, you have another single cluster. Then when you start mapping the data that's outside of your optimal cluster and delay space, you know, up here in your nominal case, you don't have a bunch of data outside of your cluster and delay space. And so, you know, that's indicative of your nominal case. Whereas down here, you have a bunch of data that's outside of your single cluster in delay space. And when you map that back over, you see that it falls in between your clusters and your time domain. So you can say, oh gosh, this is our block case. Whereas down here, you have a single cluster, a bunch of data outside of it, that it all occurs. It doesn't occur between clusters, it occurs outside of those clusters. So now you can start to see, you know, you have a way of differentiating between these three cases. And then here, where you have multiple clusters on your y plus x line, and you have data that falls outside of it, you can see here that you don't really have a cluster that connects these two features, whereas here you have a cluster that does connect these two regions in your delay space. So you can start to tell, well, here I have these two clusters are really occurring because of this non-stationarity in our time series, whereas up here, the fact we have two clusters are occurring is because we have this sort of dropout that's occurring in our instrument. And then this is the case that we're calling the masking case. Here you have a cluster that falls off the y plus x line, and this is a case where you have a transition to, you know, some other state, and then you transitions back. It's just a single point. So now you're starting to see that over here when you cluster these things. So now this is just basically, you know, you can set this up as a decision tree, and you just follow your way through. You can figure out, you know, which case you're dealing with. So this is what I was saying earlier in terms of my framework. You know, there's no way that we have mapped out all possibilities of all potential different failure modes that we would have in the time series. But you can see how one might, you know, move on with this, where you use clustering, delay space, and time domain. You figure out, you know, what's the signature of your failure mode, and then you apply the correct algorithm for scoring your data. So, you know, there's, you know, you have a Wavelet algorithm that you use to identify your outliers. You can fit that into this framework probably pretty easily. This is a graph that shows how we resolve the problem of masking. I'm going to go into that in detail. And then this graphic just shows basically all different kinds of combinations of points that you can have, and how you can use this information then in coming up with a final score on your time series. And so here at the very end now, we here have our time series that we've scored, where red is a low score, you know, a bluish color is a high score. And you can see that heuristically it's doing what, you know, we would want in terms of, as a human, if we were looking at this data, how we may classify this data. This case is interesting here because you notice this was the vertical velocity of an aircraft. If you have a vertical velocity of 10 meters per second, that's a real problem. And so this data, even though it's just looking at it as humans, we say, well, gosh, we really like the sort of autocorrelation nature of this. The actual data really is probably you know, this set of data here that's closer to zero. And so this goes to Michael's point of you really do need to incorporate, you know, human knowledge and human expert in the data, and that even though we are picking out autocorrelation here, that may not be the right thing in all cases. And so here we have, you know, all these cases looking pretty good. This last graphic is just showing the performance of the algorithm versus just a median, a median filter, an autoregressive model. And I iota. It was interesting when we published the paper originally, one of the early drafts of the paper, we presented some performance metrics, and one of the reviewers said, it's pretty clear that you spent more time tuning the iota algorithm than the other algorithms, so we have to go back and present these results. So anyway, the important thing to note here is that here you have the different colors, or the different lines on the graph. There's different percentage noise outliers in the data set. And so you can see that for the iota algorithm, there is a single threshold that you can pick such that you get good performance across a large number of outliers in your data set, or a large family. You go over by 10% outliers to say 50% outliers. It's interesting here that we're modeling uniform noise in like that case where you had just an intermittent dropout. You can see here where the intermittent dropout gets more than, I think it was 55% or 60%. Then the algorithm chooses the dropout data as being good data. And so there is that breakdown on the algorithm. And there are cases where the median does really well across a lot of different noise cases. So I think the takeaway from this is that there are times when a simple algorithm is the thing to do. Median filter, gosh, really hard to get in some cases, but then you can also come up with other cases where it's not going to work well. So anyway, here's our references, and if anyone's interested, I can do this slide.
The patent file, is that a defensive patent? Is this technique licensable?
It is licensable. It was pretty much a defensive patent. The patent is assigned to NCAR. They would love to have somebody, I think, you can talk to me about that here.
So you were talking a little bit about delay space. How exactly were you calculating delay space? Was that?
Just next points, next neighbors. So we did like I think we even went up to, we'd always refer to it as lags. So we'd either do like lag 1 or 2. I think we went up to lag 3, but that was it. And we were just looking at it sort of at a very gross statistical level to just do the clustering.
So you plot, or you look at the neighbors, and then you are doing cluster analysis on that data.
Exactly. Yeah. We're not looking at like the phase portrait or anything like that.
What about natural seasonality in the source data?
We were looking at hour timescales, so we didn't have any seasonality in the data that we were looking at.
When you is it automatic to look for the neighbors, or you have to assign neighbors by yourself first, or the algorithm itself?
Just next to the sequence, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's time-based.
Yeah, it's time-based. So we're looking at the plot of xi versus xi plus 1.
Just it's like persistence kind.
Yeah.
Time t is time.
Yeah.
So what would the interval between time and time plus 1 be? Would be a second?
Yeah, it was 1 second. And actually, that's another thing too. I had another little toy experiment that I was going to show that I didn't have mapped out on this sheet. But averaging your data, like say for instance, you have your sensor, you're collecting a bunch of data, and a lot of these sensors will have loggers on it that collect data and report like what an average. That actually, as we all know, it hides problems in your data set. And the one example I had that I was playing around with was just take just a simple sine or cosine, and then just add like just a class of data across at 0, and then look at that delay space. You get this really interesting pattern, and then you do a running average on it. You see that pattern sort of collapse, and it appears more like innovative outliers in your time series. And so I think it's interesting.
If the data is not continuous as a result of like hardware failure, like if you have big gaps where you just don't have any data that exists, the algorithm account for that?
I think it can. I'm trying to remember what I did in the algorithm. I probably blind treat investigated. I probably just treated it as stands and like how that could. I think I seem to remember having to deal with that at one time. But I never had like really big gaps. You know, it's just like just a quick hit. Other questions?
You done anything like spectrum based or you look at a frequency domain?
Yeah, no, I haven't done that.
Because it looks like, in some sense, that looking at the lag time sort of does that, because you're looking at differences. How much does it change per lag? But I mean, spectral analysis would be a little more. What you should see is like, what you also see in the lag is what's sort of the amount of change you can expect that's normal
Yeah.
from one time sequence to the next, and that sort of defines what's the frequency of change.
Yeah.
And spectral analysis. But I mean, this is way simpler than trying to run it through a fast Fourier. So this may be a simpler way to do it.
Yeah, I don't know. We didn't explore Fourier techniques, you know, at all really in this. But I mean, it's something that would be very interesting to look at. Any other questions?
Sample data could spring or rate invariant or invariant?
I'm sorry, what's that again?
Was the data rate invariant?
Yeah, it was rate invariant. Yeah, it was every second. So that was on the anemometer data sets. I have to go back and look at some of the other data sets like the aircraft and the LiDAR.
Have you tried this model with rate invariant data?
No, I haven't tried that. But I don't necessarily. I think it would actually. I don't think there would be. I think it'd still work, simply because we're doing, you know, these growth statistics in time and delay space. You know, there's. So earlier on, I said, you know, we wanted the technique as multi-resolution, and so essentially where that multi-resolution is coming from is in delay space, which tends to be like a global statistic, and then in our time domain, we just have these small, you know, I think there are 30-point windows that are used to calculate our histograms over. And so you might have to play around with that that time scale in, you know, time domain to accommodate like each multi-dimensions.
What different clustering algorithms did you explore? Or, I mean, is it density based or was it?
It was just density based.
DB scan like kind of thing. Just like to see nearest neighbor kind of density, or? Yeah,
I just calculated density and just applied a threshold and calculated the contour. And so it actually, you know, other techniques, you know, would be interesting to explore those too. But you know, that's all I did. I was sort of learning things as I went, like the whole thing about hierarchical clustering. Going into this, I wasn't familiar with hierarchical clustering. So, you know, it's like, oh wow, that's what I was doing.
And you started.
Well, we didn't patent that part of it, no.
Yeah. This measurement was taken at a very cold place, right?
Oh yeah, the
Cold environment.
yeah. So the anemometer data was the
Heated,
pardon?
is it heated or?
The heater. Oh yeah, those anemometers, those were hydrotech anemometers. They're really cool because they're about the size of a pop can, and they're quarter-inch thick steel, and they have a 1500 watt heater on the inside of them. So they actually were ice-free most of the time. The one case where there was the block where you see the you know, something that built on. Let me see if I can get the. But we actually think that what was causing that particular failure was ice buildup on. That was on the direction head, and you have the wind would be blowing and changing direction slightly, so that you would excite a normal mode probably in your anemometer head to spin. So one of my colleagues actually had a video of an anemometer with that anemometer head at Mount Washington, which is a site where they do a lot of instrumentation testing here in the continental United States. And so that's what we were thinking was occurring, right? And we see what this go back to the presentation. So that's what we were thinking was going on here. This case up here was interesting. So the wind speed head actually has, it sits on a spindle, it has gears on it. And what we think happened here was the nut came off the top of the anemometer, and the wind was blowing hard enough, it was lifting the speed head up off the spindle. And of course, then it would stop, drop to zero, and then the wind would drop down and come back down on it. So, yeah.
Would you use this also to say, not just identify the good data, but to identify the outliers and say, hey, someone needs to go look at this?
I actually think that that's the value of an algorithm like this, is really to identify. Because, a lot of times, people design instruments, and I mean, they're designed well, they operate well 99.9% of the time. It's that, small fraction of percentage of time when it's broken, you really want to know it. And so I think that, yeah, I think you're right. And it's really, I think that, being able to go and, look at this, combination of delay space and time domain and sort of diagnose, what's going on. That's valuable. Any other questions?
What part of this is actually patent? Because this is just data statistics analysis. It's not.
It's the whole. It's the whole thing, putting it all together. And it's interesting. So the co-editors on this was Ken Goodrich. I don't know if anybody knows Ken. He was a professor here at Boulder, the Mountain Department. And he said, when you look up at the end, and you see how we put it together. It's like, well, it's sort of obvious.
Yeah.
But
I get it.
Yeah.
Cool. Very cool.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to urge everybody to join us. We're going to Old Chicago on the west side of Pearl Street. Come on over. I predict that you'll meet some interesting people and make new friends. Thank you all for coming.